The invisible cost of explaining yourself. 10 mental powers that will transform your life when you stop explaining yourself begins with an uncomfortable truth. The more you explain yourself, the less powerful you feel. Not because explanation is wrong, but because constant justification slowly turns into negotiation. And when you negotiate your choices repeatedly, you begin to doubt them. Pay attention to how often you feel the urge to clarify, defend, justify. You explain your decisions before anyone questions them. You add extra details so you are not misunderstood. You soften your words so you are not judged. You rehearse arguments in your head long before they are needed. It feels responsible. It feels mature. But beneath it, there is tension, a subtle fear of being seen incorrectly, a quiet need to manage how you are perceived. This is where exhaustion begins. Not physical exhaustion, but psychological fatigue. Because every explanation carries an invisible message. I need you to agree with me so I can feel secure. And the more you depend on that agreement, the more fragile your confidence becomes. When approval is delayed, you feel unsettled. When someone disagrees, you feel compelled to defend. When someone misunderstands you, you feel obligated to correct. Stoic philosophy confronts this dynamic directly. It asks a simple but destabilizing question. What exactly belongs to your control? Your intentions, your actions, your judgments. Not the interpretation others attach to them, not their approval, not their misunderstanding. When you try to manage those things, you step outside your jurisdiction, and the mind becomes restless. Over-explaining is rarely about communication. It is about anxiety. It is about control. It is about wanting certainty in a place where certainty does not exist, and that need slowly erodes internal authority. Because each time you explain excessively, you signal to yourself that your decision is not enough on its own. What happens when you stop negotiating? What happens when your actions stand without commentary? When your boundaries exist without defense? When your silence is not weakness but discipline? These 10 mental powers will not teach you to become distant or arrogant. They will teach you to become internally anchored, to act from principle rather than perception, to accept misunderstanding without collapsing, to speak when necessary and remain silent when integrity is enough. The transformation does not begin outside. It begins when you realize that explaining yourself constantly is not strength. It is dependency disguised as clarity, and once you see that clearly, you are ready to dismantle it. The power of internal validation. If you feel the constant need to explain yourself, look beneath the words. What you are often seeking is not understanding. It is confirmation. You want reassurance that your choice makes sense, that your boundary is reasonable, that your direction is acceptable. Without noticing, you have outsourced your sense of certainty. When your decisions require audience agreement, you are no longer acting from conviction. You are acting from negotiation. And negotiation weakens authority. The more you look outside for approval, the more unstable your confidence becomes. Because external agreement is unpredictable. It shifts with mood, opinion, and perspective. Stoic discipline begins by reclaiming that center. You act because it aligns with your principles, not because it will be applauded. You choose because it is coherent with your reasoning, not because it will be universally understood. When internal validation is strong, explanation becomes optional, not compulsive. This does not mean you never communicate. It means you do not depend on reaction to confirm your worth. You can state your decision once, clearly, without over-elaboration. You can allow disagreement without rushing to repair it. You can tolerate silence without filling it with defense. Notice how much energy is saved when you stop trying to secure approval for every move. That energy returns to you as clarity. Your words become fewer but stronger. Your posture becomes quieter but firmer, because certainty no longer depends on applause. When internal validation stabilizes, the urge to explain begins to weaken. But another question emerges. If you are not responsible for securing agreement, what are you actually responsible for? That distinction changes everything. The power of cognitive boundaries. Once you stop outsourcing validation, you face a deeper realization. Not every misunderstanding is your responsibility. Not every opinion requires correction. Not every perception must be managed. Yet most people live as if they are accountable for how they are interpreted. This is where confusion about control begins. You control your intention, your effort, your conduct. You do not control how others decode it. The Stoics were precise about this distinction. Your domain ends at your action. The interpretation belongs to someone else's mind. When you attempt to govern both, you create internal conflict. Over-explaining is often an attempt to manage perception. You fear being seen incorrectly. You rush to clarify before someone forms a conclusion, but in doing so, you step into territory that was never yours. You cannot fully engineer how others think, and trying to do so drains mental energy. Cognitive boundaries restore order. They define what is yours and what is not. Your words can be clear. Your behavior can be coherent. Beyond that, acceptance must begin. If someone misreads you despite clarity, that misunderstanding is not a moral failure on your part. When you internalize this boundary, something stabilizes. You stop chasing universal agreement. You accept that perception will vary. Your responsibility narrows to what you can actually govern, and narrowing responsibility reduces anxiety. But even with clear boundaries, another force pushes you to explain. It is not logic, it is emotion, a subtle urgency that demands immediate justification. That is what we must confront next. The power of emotional containment. The urge to explain rarely begins with logic. It begins with discomfort. A comment unsettles you. A look feels ambiguous. A disagreement creates tension. And before reflection occurs, emotion pushes you forward. You start clarifying, defending, elaborating. Not because it is necessary, but because it relieves internal pressure. Over-explaining is often emotional leakage. Anxiety does not like silence. It interprets uncertainty as threat. When someone does not immediately agree, your nervous system reacts as if something is unstable. The impulse to justify becomes an attempt to restore equilibrium. If they understand me, I will feel secure. If they agree, the tension will disappear. But this makes your calm dependent on their reaction. Emotional containment changes the sequence. Instead of reacting immediately, you pause. You notice the discomfort without trying to dissolve it through explanation. You allow the feeling to exist without turning it into speech. This is discipline at the emotional level, not the verbal one. The Stoics practiced this containment deliberately. They understood that the first emotional impulse is automatic, but the second response is chosen. Between feeling and reacting, there is a narrow space. In that space, authority is either strengthened or surrendered. When you learn to hold emotion without rushing to justify, something shifts. Your words become deliberate rather than defensive. Your silence becomes stable rather than tense. You speak because it is necessary, not because you are uncomfortable. This containment reduces over-explaining at its root. Because when emotional urgency fades, excessive justification no longer feels required. But even when emotions are steady, there is another discipline that must be developed. The discipline of silence itself. And silence, when used correctly, is not weakness, it is strength. That is the next power. The power of strategic silence. Silence makes most people uncomfortable, not because silence is harmful, but because it removes control over how you are perceived. When you stop explaining, you leave space. And in that space, others may form conclusions without your supervision. That is precisely why silence feels risky. But silence, when deliberate, is discipline. Many responses that feel necessary are not. They are reflexes. You clarify to avoid being misunderstood. You elaborate to prevent assumption. You defend to protect image. Yet each unnecessary explanation signals insecurity. It suggests that your decision cannot stand without reinforcement. Strategic silence reverses that dynamic. You speak once, clearly, then you stop. If someone disagrees, you do not rush to convince. If someone misinterprets, You evaluate whether correction is essential. If it is not, you let the misunderstanding exist. Not out of pride, but out of clarity about your boundaries. The Stoics valued restraint in speech. Words were tools, not shields. Speaking less does not mean hiding. It means refusing to dilute your authority with excessive justification. Silence creates weight. It forces your actions to carry meaning without commentary. Notice how powerful a calm pause can be. When you do not fill every gap, your presence becomes steadier. Your communication becomes precise. You do not withdraw. You stabilize. Strategic silence also protects energy. Every unnecessary explanation consumes mental resources. By choosing when to speak and when to remain quiet, you conserve strength for what truly matters. Yet silence alone is not enough, because often the need to explain is tied to wanting a specific outcome. You want them to agree, you want them to approve, you want them to see you correctly. And that attachment to outcome is the deeper chain. That is what we address next. The power of outcome detachment. At the root of most over-explaining is not communication. It is attachment. You are not simply sharing your reasoning. You are trying to influence the reaction. You want understanding. You want agreement. You want acceptance. And when the desired response does not immediately appear, you intensify your explanation. This is where suffering begins. When you attach your emotional stability to how others receive your words, you surrender authority. Your peace becomes conditional. If they approve, you feel secure. If they question, you feel unsettled. If they reject, you feel compelled to defend. The explanation becomes longer, not because clarity is needed, but because validation is. Stoic discipline confronts this directly. You control your action, you do not control its reception. Once your words are spoken, their interpretation belongs to another mind. Trying to dictate that interpretation is an invisible form of control-seeking. And control-seeking over what is not yours creates anxiety. Outcome detachment restores balance. You state your position clearly and accept that reactions may vary. You do not attempt to manipulate agreement. You do not extend explanations simply to soften resistance. You allow others to think as they will. This does not mean indifference, it means realism. When attachment to reaction loosens, over-explaining loses its fuel. You no longer feel compelled to repair every disagreement. You no longer see misunderstanding as failure. Your role is to act with integrity. The outcome is outside your jurisdiction. This shift creates quiet strength. Your decisions stand independently of applause. Your boundaries remain intact even when questioned. And your communication becomes concise because it is no longer driven by anxiety. Yet there is another layer beneath attachment to outcome. If your identity fluctuates based on feedback, detachment will feel unstable, because you will still seek confirmation at a deeper level. That is why identity stability must be built next. The power of identity stability. If your sense of self shifts with feedback, you will always feel the urge to explain. Because every disagreement will feel like a threat. Every misunderstanding will feel like distortion. And every criticism will feel like erosion of who you are. When identity is unstable, explanation becomes self-defense. Many people do not over-explain because they lack clarity. They over-explain because their identity depends on being perceived correctly. If others misunderstand them, they feel reduced. If others disapprove, they feel diminished. So they speak more, clarify more, justify more, attempting to preserve a version of themselves in the minds of others. But identity that depends on perception is fragile. Stoic philosophy anchors identity in character, not reputation, in intention, not interpretation. Who you are is defined by your principles and actions, not by how they are received. When this becomes internalized, external feedback loses its power to destabilize you. Identity stability creates calm brevity. If you know who you are, you do not panic when someone sees you differently. You evaluate whether the criticism is useful. If it is, you adjust. If it is not, you let it pass. You do not collapse into defense. You do not scramble for approval. This stability reduces the psychological need to correct every perception. You no longer feel that silence threatens your integrity. Your character remains intact regardless of commentary. Notice the difference between someone who is secure and someone who is not. The secure individual speaks clearly and stops. The insecure one continues, searching for reassurance in every additional sentence. When identity is grounded in principle rather than applause, your posture changes. You do not become arrogant, you become steady. And from that steadiness, another refinement becomes possible. The ability to reduce mental drama and speak only to what is factual. That refinement is interpretive minimalism. The power of interpretive minimalism. Most over-explaining is not about facts, it is about narratives. You do not simply state what happened. You add context, intention, background, justification, emotional framing. You expand the story to make sure it is understood the way you want it to be understood. And the more you expand it, the more dramatic it becomes. Interpretive minimalism is the discipline of stripping events down to what is real and necessary. When something occurs, there is the fact. Then there is your interpretation. Then there is the emotional layer attached to that interpretation. Over-explaining often arises from the need to defend the interpretation rather than the fact. You try to manage how others will feel about your reasoning. You attempt to preempt objections. You fill gaps that may not even exist. This mental expansion creates internal noise. The Stoics practiced precise perception. They separated what happened from what it meant. They avoided exaggeration. They described reality without ornament. This clarity reduced emotional turbulence and unnecessary argument. When you adopt interpretive minimalism, your communication changes. You state what is true. You omit unnecessary embellishment. You do not dramatize your motives. You do not construct elaborate defenses. If explanation is required, it is brief and factual. This reduces vulnerability, because the more narrative you provide, the more material there is to challenge. The more emotional framing you include, the more you reveal anxiety beneath your words. Minimalism does not mean coldness, it means precision. You begin to notice how often your mind wants to add layers, to anticipate objections, to justify intentions before they are questioned. By refusing that impulse, you conserve energy and strengthen clarity. But clarity alone is not enough, because sometimes over-explaining is not about narrative expansion. It is about revealing too much too quickly in an attempt to protect yourself. That is where controlled exposure becomes essential. The power of controlled exposure. There is a subtle mistake many people make when they feel misunderstood. They reveal more. They add personal details, emotional context, past experiences, hidden motivations. They believe that if they expose enough of themselves, clarity will finally be achieved. But often, the opposite happens. The more you reveal defensively, the more vulnerable you feel. Over-explaining frequently comes from excessive exposure. When you feel the need to justify, you begin to open layers that were never required to be opened. You share private reasoning to protect your image. You disclose personal doubts to avoid appearing rigid. You attempt to soften perception by making yourself more transparent. Yet this transparency is not strength, it is anxiety seeking security. Controlled exposure is the discipline of choosing what is necessary to share and what is not. Not everything about your motives needs to be public. Not every thought requires explanation. Not every decision demands access to your internal process. When you reveal selectively, you protect psychological stability. When you reveal impulsively, you weaken it. The Stoics valued restraint not only in speech but in disclosure. Privacy was not secrecy, it was sovereignty. You do not owe the world complete access to your reasoning. You owe it coherence in your action. Controlled exposure reduces the pressure to over-justify, because you stop believing that understanding requires full transparency. Sometimes clarity comes from brevity. Sometimes strength comes from reserve. Notice how powerful it feels when you share only what is necessary. Your words carry weight. Your presence feels contained. You are not hiding. You are choosing. But even with discipline and exposure, one fear often remains. The fear that despite your clarity, someone will still misunderstand you. And the instinct will be to correct it immediately. To move forward, you must confront something uncomfortable. Misunderstanding is inevitable. The power of accepting misunderstanding. No matter how clearly you speak, someone will misinterpret you. No matter how carefully you explain, someone will form a conclusion you did not intend. This is not failure, it is reality. And yet most people resist this reality with force. The fear of being misunderstood drives excessive explanation. You assume that if someone sees you inaccurately, your integrity is compromised. You believe that reputation must be managed constantly. So you clarify again, you restate, you expand. You try to eliminate ambiguity completely. But ambiguity cannot be eliminated entirely. Human perception is filtered through experience, bias, and emotion. Stoic discipline accepts this limitation without collapse. You are responsible for clarity of intention and coherence of action. You are not responsible for universal agreement. When someone misunderstands despite your sincerity, the instinct to correct must be examined. Is clarification necessary, or is it an attempt to control perception? Accepting misunderstanding does not mean indifference. It means recognizing the boundary of influence. You can correct factual errors. You cannot control interpretation. When you internalize this, something powerful happens. The urgency to defend weakens. You no longer feel destabilized by every incorrect assumption. You allow space for imperfection in how you are seen. This acceptance restores calm authority. Your identity does not fracture when someone misreads you. Your principles do not dissolve when someone disagrees. You remain anchored. And once you are no longer fighting to be perfectly understood, you discover the final transformation. Real power does not lie in explanation. It lies in consistency. That is where sovereign action begins. The power of detached reputation. There is one more layer beneath the habit of explaining yourself, and it is more subtle than insecurity or emotional urgency. It is attachment to reputation. Not reputation as vanity, but reputation as safety. You believe that if others see you correctly, you will be protected. Protected from exclusion, from rejection, from misjudgment. So you manage perception carefully. You clarify. You defend. You attempt to keep your image aligned with your intention. But reputation is not entirely yours to govern. You can influence it through conduct, but you cannot control its final shape. It lives in other minds. It shifts according to their experiences, expectations, and projections. When you attempt to fully control it, you enter a game you cannot win, because you are trying to stabilize something that is inherently unstable. The Stoics understood this distinction deeply. They valued honor, but they did not depend on admiration. They acted according to virtue, not applause. If their reputation aligned with their character, good. If it did not, they examined themselves honestly. If no fault was found, they remained steady. They did not exhaust themselves correcting every perception. Detached reputation is not indifference. It is alignment. You care about acting with integrity. You care about coherence. But you do not measure your worth by how consistently you are praised or understood. You do not panic when someone forms a narrow conclusion about you. You evaluate whether correction is necessary. If it is, you respond briefly. If it is not, you allow time to clarify what words cannot. Over-explaining is often an attempt to secure reputation prematurely. You want immediate clarity, immediate validation, immediate alignment between how you see yourself and how others see you. But real alignment is built over repeated action, not over extended justification. When you detach from reputation anxiety, your posture changes. You stop trying to be perfectly perceived. You focus instead on being internally consistent. And paradoxically, that consistency strengthens reputation more than explanation ever could. There is also a deeper freedom here. When you no longer obsess over how you are seen, your energy returns to what you are doing. You invest attention in action, not image. You refine your character rather than polishing your narrative. Ask yourself honestly, if no one misunderstood you, would you feel safer? Or would you still seek confirmation in new forms? Often the problem is not misunderstanding. It is dependency on perception for stability. Detached reputation breaks that dependency. You accept that some people will see only fragments of you. Some will project their fears. Some will misunderstand your silence as arrogance or your firmness as coldness. You evaluate calmly. If correction serves principle, you speak. If not, you remain steady. This steadiness is not passive. It is deliberate. It requires courage to let go of the illusion that you can engineer how you are viewed. It requires maturity to accept that your responsibility ends at your conduct. When you internalize this power, explanation becomes intentional rather than compulsive. You speak when clarity is needed. You remain silent when justification is unnecessary. Your reputation becomes a byproduct of consistent character, not constant defense. And in that shift, something profound happens. You stop living in anticipation of judgment. You start living in alignment with principle. That is freedom, the power of deliberate delay. There is one discipline that quietly dissolves the habit of over-explaining before it even begins. It is the power of delay. Not avoidance, not withdrawal. Delay. The ability to pause between stimulus and response, between discomfort and speech, between accusation and justification. Most excessive explanation does not arise from clarity. It arises from speed. Someone questions you, you respond immediately. Someone looks uncertain. You rush to clarify. Someone hesitates. You begin filling the silence. The urgency feels necessary, but that urgency is rarely rational. It is emotional acceleration, and acceleration distorts judgment. Deliberate delay restores authority. The Stoics trained themselves to resist immediacy. They understood that the first impulse is rarely the wisest one. The first urge is defensive. The first reaction is protective. The first explanation is often longer than necessary because it is trying to manage discomfort rather than communicate truth. When you practice delay, you interrupt that pattern. You feel the impulse to justify, but you do not obey it instantly. You allow the moment to breathe. You observe the tension without converting it into words. You let the silence exist without rushing to repair it. In that brief space, something shifts. Emotion loses momentum. Clarity has time to surface. Delay reveals what is actually required. Sometimes you discover that no explanation is necessary. The other person was not accusing you. They were simply processing. Sometimes you realize that a short sentence is enough. Sometimes you recognize that the urge to clarify is rooted in fear, not fact. Without delay, you would never see this distinction. This discipline also exposes a deeper truth. Over-explaining is often a strategy to reduce uncertainty. You speak more because you want to control the atmosphere. You want to secure comfort quickly. But comfort achieved through haste is fragile. Stability achieved through composure is durable. Deliberate delay strengthens composure. When you resist immediate reaction, you communicate confidence without words. You demonstrate that your position does not require frantic reinforcement. Your silence becomes intentional, not anxious. Your speech becomes measured, not excessive. This does not mean you become slow or indifferent. It means you choose timing deliberately. You answer when clarity demands it. You remain quiet when explanation would only serve insecurity. There is also a psychological transformation that happens through delay. You begin to tolerate ambiguity. You stop fearing short pauses. You stop assuming that every moment of uncertainty requires correction. You learn that misunderstanding, if it exists, can survive a few seconds without collapsing your identity. And that tolerance builds strength. Because the person who can wait before responding has authority over themselves. They are not pulled by impulse. They are not governed by tension. They choose their words rather than being driven by them. Over time, this practice becomes natural. You no longer feel the compulsion to immediately defend. You assess. You breathe. You respond from principle rather than pressure. In this way, deliberate delay becomes one of the most practical forms of Stoic power. It embodies the gap between impression and consent. It honors the distinction between emotion and action. It protects dignity without aggression. And perhaps most importantly, it proves something quietly transformative. You are not controlled by the pace of others. You are governed by your own rhythm. When explanation no longer erupts from urgency, it becomes precise. When silence no longer feels threatening, it becomes strength. When delay becomes discipline, your presence changes. You no longer speak to survive the moment. You speak because the moment truly requires it. That is composure, the power of self-governed action. At the end of all explanation lies a simple truth. Words are secondary. Conduct is primary. When your actions are consistent with your principles, explanation becomes unnecessary, not because others will always understand, but because you no longer depend on that understanding to remain steady. Self-governed action is the highest form of authority. When you stop explaining compulsively, you are forced to confront something deeper. Do your actions stand on their own? Are they aligned with values you have examined? If they are, silence strengthens them. If they are not, explanation only hides the inconsistency. The Stoics did not aim to be perceived as virtuous. They aimed to be virtuous. That distinction removes the need to manage image. If your decision is rational and aligned with your character, it does not require elaborate defense. You state it once, you live it, you move forward. Consistency dissolves insecurity. When your behavior reflects your principles repeatedly, others either adapt or distance themselves. Neither outcome requires excessive explanation. Your clarity becomes evident over time, and time speaks louder than argument. Self-governed action also liberates mental energy. You no longer rehearse conversations in your head. You no longer preempt criticism before it appears. You no longer negotiate your boundaries internally. You act, and you accept the consequences within your control. This is sovereignty, not dominance over others, not control over perception, control over alignment. The alignment between what you believe and what you do. When explanation is no longer used to manage identity, silence becomes strength. When action replaces justification, stability replaces anxiety. The quiet authority of the unexplained. You do not become distant when you stop explaining yourself. You become grounded. You do not become silent. You become deliberate. You do not withdraw from life. You stabilize within it. The need to justify was never about communication. It was about control and approval. By understanding what belongs to you and what does not, you reclaim internal authority. Your validation becomes internal. Your boundaries become clear. Your emotions become contained. Your silence becomes strategic. Your identity becomes stable. The world will continue to interpret you through its own lens. That does not diminish your integrity, because your integrity no longer depends on interpretation. When you stop explaining yourself to manage perception, you start living from coherence. And coherence does not shout. It stands. If you want refinement, stronger hooks, tighter pacing, or a more intense version, type the changes you want.